Good evening. Welcome to our next Macau Ricci Institute Forum, this time based on titled Syriac Christians in Tang, China, offered us by Dr. Alexis Balmont from Chinese University of Hong Kong. This topic is of particular importance for the history of inculturation of Christianity in China. And Dr. Alexis has been working in this field for some time already. And there is one of the recent publications just came out, a series that is started, was launched at the Center for Catholic Studies, the classic, Christian classic. This is the first volume of Irenaeus from Lyon. And there will be following volumes about this. It's a critical edition in original languages and Chinese translation. So it's a very precious work. Congratulations for this wonderful contribution. So the speaker will be introduced properly by our friend from the faculty, Dr. Sonia Xia. Without further ado, we ask, please welcome our speaker today.
So actually, I don't need to say too much things here, but I really want to share with you the wonderful resume of our Dr. Alexis Balmont. He's a researcher at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and associate researcher at several institutions in France. One, I don't pretend I can pronounce French, but yeah, like Eastern Asian Civilization in Paris, and another Institute of Christian Source in Lyon. And he has dual doctorates. One is he got from the École Pratique des Hautes Études, right, in Paris, in Chinese Studies. And another one from the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome in Oriental Studies. Aside from that, he knows 4 languages. I think more than 4, like a lot of European languages, I'm sure. But aside from that, they are classical Chinese, Syriac, Sogdian, and Greek. And his research focuses on the intersection of Syriac Christianity, classical Chinese literature, and the religious history of the Silk Road. And his works also across several disciplines, sinology, patristic philosophy, and digital humanity. And he has tons of publications. So I think we can already know how exciting this lecture will be. So I will not use any further time here.
So good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for your very kind invitation. So my goal in the next hour to introduce you to my field, which is the history of Christianity during the Tang period in China. I will first speak about the historical context, because many of us are not very familiar with what we call the Church of the East and the missions in Central Asia and in China. And then I will try to present you the text we have, 7 texts, maybe 9. We will discuss a bit about the authenticity of the manuscripts we have. And then, because many of you, I can see, are researchers or have an interest in research, I will try to advocate a bit for more studies on this text and to give a few directions for possible research in the future. So let's talk a bit about the historical context. Many of us are very familiar with the church as it went in the West, in the Roman Empire or beyond. And we know that there was a church that became the Byzantine Church. We know that there was also some Christians east from the Byzantine Church, but we are less familiar with those Christians. We know that the gospel spread very early from the beginning in many directions, and especially in the East, in the Persian Empire, that will quickly become, starting from the 3rd century, the Sassanid Empire. We find some attestations in historical sources, for example, in the Pauline epistles, We know that Paul, when he got converted, spent sometimes in Damas, and there was a Christian community over there. And then we still have some books, especially from Bardejan the Persian, who attest that there was some Christian communities east from the Roman Empire. And the church in the east followed the same kind of structuration than in the west, which is some dioceses were founded, some priests were ordained, some Christians existed, and the church became more structured during the 4th and 5th century. What is specific about that church, you can see here on the map, is that it used some Semitic languages. First, some Aramaic on the top of the screen that used the Aramaic alphabet that we know because it's the same as the Hebrew alphabet. Then some Syriac in between, and then starting from the Arabic conquest at the beginning of the 7th century, many of the theological works were written in Arabic. The second characterization of this church, maybe what makes it very distinctive, was it was a very missionary church in a world that was very connected from the Persian and Sassanid Empire to Central Asia. And there were some deportations of Christians following some conquest, especially of Antioch. And we find some traces of Christian communities in Bactria, which is the north of Afghanistan, as soon as the 3rd or 4th century. Of course, I see that there are some people maybe from India here. There was also the Christians from South India. Because of maybe politics, the church in the east and the church in the west had some theological differentiations or disagreements, and tried to distantiate the one from the others, so as not to be associated with Romans when you lived in the Sassanid Empire, or with the enemy when you lived on the other side of the border. And because also of politics, part of the Christians had to migrate more and more east, especially at the beginning of the 7th century. On the map here, you can see the Arabic conquest from Arabia to the Sassanid Empire. And we know that part of the court of the nobles that were in Persia migrated very far east up to China. And from the sources we have, especially in 651, the last of the Sassanian kings was buried in Merv in Central Asia. We know that the bishop of the city conducted a liturgy for the repose of his soul, which indicates that there were many Christians in the court. And we know that the part of the court fled to China, especially in Chang'an, in the capital, and that a territory was given to them to live for a few decades, which is here, Bosse Dudufu, that you can see on the red point on the map over there. And we find some Christian relics in the region. We know also that during the 3rd to the 10th century, the Silk Roads were very internationalized, which is there were some trades from China up to the Roman Empire, following the commercial roads in Central Asia that you find the map here. And especially one of the people who were very involved in the trades were the Sogdians. Maybe you heard of the Sogdians. The Sogdians is the name of people that would be located today in Uzbekistan, in Samarkand, Bukhara, and so on, and used 3 alphabets. So I put you here a manuscript of Christian Sogdian that used an alphabet derived from the Syriac alphabet. And we find many relics of Sogdian Christians. I put a few pictures here. So you have a Christian manuscript on the left. You have a very beautiful silver plate that represents the fall of Jericho, which is a biblical theme. You will find some coins with some what we call Nestorian crosses. And some excavations are going on in Uzbekistan today for very big monasteries and basilica. And so there was a time where many Sogdians converted to Christianity. And the Sogdians, because of trade, had some colonies in China. And there was a special status for them to stay and live and make some business in the western regions, Xiyu, especially in the region of Dunhuang, Tufan, and more to Chang'an. If you go to Chang'an and you see some reconstitutions of the old city, there was an entire neighborhood that was reserved for foreigners and especially for Sogdian people that are usually called in the Chinese sources the Hu, which mainly designate the Sogdians. And so Christianity came in China mainly through waves of migrations. And I think in the sources we can identify three main waves. I spoke a bit about the Persians that came by the court and by the nobles who fled the Arabic conquest. And also there were some exchanges between the Sassanid court and the Chinese court. The kings practiced what we call the hostages. They sent some sons of the families in China to be educated, and some Chinese young boys were sent to Syriac Ctesiphon to be educated there, to have some relations between the two nobles. The Sogdians came mainly for business, for making some trades. And then there was a third wave of immigration. I will talk a bit more about that. At the middle of the 8th century, coming from Bactria, from the north of Afghanistan, because following what we call the An Lushan rebellion, the Tang emperor called some Bactrian mercenaries to help him regain the throne. And in the sources, you can find that some Christians were present among the soldiers. The foreigners came in China with their religions, and Christianity was part of one of what the Song period sources called the three foreign religions: San Yi Jiao, Christianity, which is called Qing Jiao, the religion of scriptures, or Qing Jiao, the luminous religion, the auspicious religion, alongside with Manichaeism, Moni Jiao, and Zoroastrianism, which is called in the source by a specific character, Xian, which represents the sky with the key for what is divine. I don't have so much time to describe, but maybe you already know Manichaeism, a religious movement that were founded in the 3rd century by a prophet named Mani, and that borrowed many aspects from existing religions, including Christianity. And Zoroastrianism or Mazdaism is a very old religion that was the official religion during the Sassanid period, and that reveres Ahura Mazda, the god, and the presence of the fire. You can see on this little picture that the man is wearing something to cover his mouth because he's serving a fire so that his mouth and his breath doesn't pollute the fire. Christianity was officially accepted in 638, and we find a reference in the Tang Yao, in the historical sources of the Chinese Empire, of a decree taken by the Emperor Taizong that welcomes Christianity and that authorizes the spread of this religion that is labeled by the emperor as Zheng, which is orthodox, and so as being able to be diffused in all the empire. And we know that a monastery was founded in Chang'an with the possibility to welcome 21 monks. We'll come back a bit on that. It's a possibility is that the presence of the monks was part of diplomatic relations between the Sassanid Empire and the Tang Chinese court. Then if we make very quickly the story of the Tang period, you will have one main event, which is the An Lushan rebellion, Anshu Chuluan in 755, that will shift a bit the relation of the court with foreigners and with foreign religions. And starting from this event, the Sogdians, the Persians, the Bactrians will be not so welcomed as in the past. And there is a trend, so there is a debate to see how far this trend and how deep this trend was, but that finished to the Huaichang Miefo, which is in 845, all foreign religions were banned from China. It was aimed against Buddhism at the beginning, but then the decree that was taken also invited all foreign clergy to leave China, and many of the clergy came to live in the west of the country. That was just shifting from the Tibetan domination to what we call the Guiyitun, which is that there was a kind of independence in the region of Dunhuang and Tufan that allowed foreign clergy to stay in the neighborhood of China. This story was quite unknown till the 20th century. The only source we had was the Xi'an stele. Usually we refer to it by calling the Xi'an stele, but there are many steles in Xi'an, so I will call it the Qingqiao monument, or the Christian Xi'an stele, which is on the left, that was discovered at the beginning of the 17th century. So there was some work near Chang'an, the old city of Chang'an, near the actual Xi'an, and we found a big stele. I will come back on the content, and an official that lived in Beijing for a while and that participated in the catechism course of Matteo Ricci identified the content of the monument to be Christian, and called some French Jesuits that were around, especially Nicolas Trigot, to see and document the monument. And it went very quickly in the West. There was Athanasius Kircher, who made the first edition of the text. It was translated, studied for 4th century now. In 1908, there was a second discovery. Maybe you can recognize the scholar on the picture, which is Paul Pelliot, a French philologist and explorer, who participated in a wave of explorations that were made in Central Asia and in China to find and take some relics back in Europe. There was a kind of competition between Germany, France, Russia, Great Britain, and Paul Pelliot was the member of what we call in French the Mission Pelliot. 3 people, Paul Pelliot, a photographer and a topographer, and he went in the western regions to find some relics to take back to France. And especially he stopped in Tufan. And in Tufan, he met with an official, a Chinese official, that showed him a manuscript coming from Dunhuang. That was a manuscript from the 8th century, a Buddhist sutra. And Pelliot knew through this manuscript that a big discovery was made in Dunhuang. It what we call today the Cave 17, which is a Taoist priest renovating the caves, found a hidden place where there was 10,000 of manuscripts that were sealed. The best explanation for that during the conquest of the Karakanids in 1006. And it was one of the major discoveries of the beginning of the 20th century. Pelliot went there. He negotiated with the Taoist monk to stay in the cave during 3 weeks. And he identified the manuscript, and he took those he found the more interesting. Especially, he found 3 leaves of Christian material. I will come back to that are now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and that contain some Christian text. Then he took many manuscripts, he sent them in France, but he kept what he found the most interesting to study them. He came back in Hanoi, where there was the delegation of the École Française d'Extrême Orient, where he was working for. And then he went to Beijing with a mission from the Bibliothèque Nationale to buy some books. And he had part of the manuscripts with him. And some Chinese scholars in Beijing at the time knew of that and wanted to see the manuscripts and to copy them. And especially among the scholars who were there was a scholar named Luo Chenyu, who saw the Christian manuscripts and made a first edition of this text in 1909. And the scholars in Beijing, they made a petition for the Ministry of Education so that the remaining manuscripts of Dunhuang should be taken back to Beijing so that Western explorers do not steal them anymore. And in charge of this operation to take the manuscript back, there was somebody of the family of another official, a Chinese official named Li Shengduo, which is here on the photograph upon 1910. And we know that Li Shengduo took a large part of the manuscripts coming back from Dunhuang to get them in his private collection. And among the manuscripts that ended up in his private collections, there were some Christian manuscripts. Why did Pelliot did not take these manuscripts? Because they didn't have some colophon, which is a small explanations of why the text was written, who wrote the text, and so on. And Pelliot chose the manuscripts he identified for sure. So some of the Christian manuscripts in Dunhuang ended up in the private collection of Li Shengduo. Then you have two other manuscripts that showed up in Japanese private collections. The first by Takakushu, who was a Japanese scholar, and the second by Tomioka. You can see the pictures of the two men up there. And we don't know so much where the manuscript come from, maybe from Dunhuang, maybe from the region. But another scholar named Haneda first documented these manuscripts and published some articles about them in 1918 and 1924. And you have some other manuscripts showing up in 1943. There is a Japanese scholar named Peter Yoshiro Saeki, who said to have received some photographs from the belongings of Li Shengduo with two other manuscripts. And we will come back to these two pieces. And very recently, 20 years ago, at the occasion of a conference, an international conference organized abroad, some people of the Museum of Luoyang made some publications about a funerary pillar. You find a picture here that contained some Christian material. So this is what we have. If we resume on this table, you will find all the primary sources with the year of discovery, the year of first publication, and because some of them were in private collections, you can see that there is quite a lot of time between the year of discovery and the year of publication, and the place where they are held today. Some of them disappeared, but reappeared in an exhibition in Osaka in 2009. As you can see, this corpus of primary sources has quite a complicated history. And part of my research and my PhD research is to try to organize and make it clear of the sources we have and what we know about them. So if we resume, I would say that there were two main regions for the production of Christian material. First in central China, especially during the 8th century. And then in the Western regions, and I advocate for some of the manuscripts to have been written directly in the Western regions. If you follow the place where the manuscripts were written, it's mainly the places where foreigners lived in China. So let's describe a bit the text now. So you will find many very good publications to dig more if you want. So I build a bit about these publications. I recommend it's an occasion to make a bit of marketing for mine. But you will find also some very good other publications in English or in Chinese. Here I should add some other books. If you are interested in the matter, don't hesitate to contact me and I will send you the updated bibliography. The first is the Qingqiao monument. So I think many of us are already familiar. So I just say a few words. For the content, there is a theological account of Christian doctrine centered on creation and redemption, and a description of the monastic community. Then you will have an historical narrative of the Christian community from 635 to the period of the construction of the monument in 781. Then, as the style of the steles wants a praise for the donor of the stele that tells about his career and achievements, and then a conclusive poem that resumes the first two parts. You have approximately 2,000 Chinese characters, and what is very interesting is that on the side of the monuments, you have bilingual list of names in Chinese and in Syriac script, in Estrangelo, that indicates many things about the community, the Christian community that lived in Chang'an. It's a very interesting source for reconstructing the history of the community, even though it's a bit propaganda document where the spread of Christianity is told in a maybe not very historical way. But you will find many things about the relations between Zhongguo, between China and the West. And especially, you will find some reference in the monument to Daqin, which is a name to designate the Byzantine Empire. And you will find many interesting material to know more about the beginning of Christianity in China. Then I come back to the manuscript that we usually don't know so well. So I talk a bit about the Paleo manuscript 47, that is now at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The first sleeve contains a Chinese version of what we would call today the Gloria, which is adapted to Chinese poetry, heptasyllabic, with 4 verses at each stanza. The manuscript was probably copied during the 9th or the 10th century, but the text itself was very probably composed during the 8th century. It's an evidence that part of the liturgy was probably said in Chinese, which was also the case in other regions where you had the Church of the East, Syriac Christianity, which is the liturgy, main parts of the liturgy were said in Syriac, but you would find some parts that were said in a vernacular language, here in Chinese. So it's a very interesting text because it uses a lot of Buddhistic and Taoist words and also some Manichaean vocabulary. You will find some identical expressions between Christians and Manichaean text. Another leaves on the same manuscript, Paleo 47, is the Tunsing. So my personal view is that it's a liturgical text that follows a Buddhistic model. Maybe the most close reference to us is what we call the Litany of the Saints, that invocates some saints or some reverend people to gain their protection. And not only people here, but also some books. So you will find 35 titles of books that are considered to be honored. It's a bit a mystery because among the books, there seem to be also some Manichaean books. And many of the titles today resist a definitive identification. There's also a little note of the manuscript that tells about the history of Christianity in China. And there are some debates to know if the manuscript was copied by a Christian or by a librarian that copied many texts, including a Christian manuscript, and that told what he knew about this tradition. Then I come to the manuscript that was discovered in 1917, which is a very long manuscript, which bears the title Yishen Lun. That is certainly a manuscript that was copied a bit not very good in the 8th century of some content that I believe was written before. It's included in what we call the Tomioka manuscript today, and there is an ongoing debate to know if this manuscript is an authentic, and most of the researchers take it as an authentic. There is a theory to label it as a refined forgery. What is a refined forgery? Somebody finds a manuscript but is in a very bad state, so you cannot sell it at a high price. So somebody copies a real content on a modern material. And you will find one researcher, which is Zhong Xinqiang, who advocates for the manuscript to be a forgery. So in my research, I advocate for the manuscript to at least include some authentic material. And I take some examples, which is, for example, in part of the manuscript, there is a big part on demonology. The author is preaching and he's teaching about the demons, and he calls one of the demons Chamnu in Chinese, which is a Sogdian name that was only identified at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's very unlikely that a forger in China would have known the name of the demon used in a Sogdian language that disappeared in the 11th century. For the content, it's a kind of preaching that teaches on God, on the world, on human life, then on the choices to take between the demons and God. And then you will find a big part that is a strange version of what we call the Sermon of the Mount today, part of the Gospel of Matthew. Then the preacher is teaching about the Paschal mystery, the life and death of the Messiah and his resurrection, and the beginnings of the church. And at the end, there is a long exhortation that addresses the people who are the receiver of the preaching, to advocate them and to encourage them to convert to Christianity. I will come back to that, but I think this manuscript is especially valuable for early Christian studies because it contains many material that you will find in apocryphal writings. Some stories to supplement the gospel, to explain some passages. So it's part close to the gospel, but in a way that is very close to many Syriac writings. Another manuscript that showed up in 1922, which is the Book of the Messiah, but with a strange title that seems to contain many mistakes, is included in a manuscript that stops at the middle of a narration of the death of the Messiah. So the Messiah is on the cross, and suddenly the manuscript stops. But it contains mainly three parts: a teaching on God and his relation with humankind, a teaching on God's law, which is borrowed many from the Ancient Testament laws, especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and then a description of the Messiah's life and death. The theological content of the manuscript is very uncommon. I wrote a paper recently in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, where I try to demonstrate that the author is borrowing some theological thoughts from what we call the Pseudo-Clementines today, which is a corpus of texts written in the 4th century, where you will find some specific teachings that are not very mainstream in Christianity, like vegetarianism. So the fact that God teaches people not to eat some meat. So it's more an uncommon theological content. Then you will find some more common material. So this is one of the texts that is on one of the manuscripts today in Osaka, funerary pillar that was rediscovered in 2006, which is entitled The Book of the Revelation of the Perfect Principle of the Primary Origin, which is very metaphysical, which talks about the creation of the world and that tries to teach that God is the origin of the origin. What is specific is also very apocryphal, which is the manuscript is telling about a revelation given by a prince of the law in Nazareth when all the nations gather to have a final teaching about the truth. And what is very specific about this manuscript, if you compare it to the others, is that it borrows many Buddhistic, metaphysical, and philosophical material, which are quite complicated. This is the manuscript I prefer, which is a dialogue between the Messiah and one of his apostles, Simon Peter in Chinese, that teaches about the ways to get bliss or to get the joy and peace of the mystics. And so this is a dialogue between a master and a disciple that teaches about the good techniques to gain freedom and happiness, and to gain the nirvana. And that delineates a spiritual path in 4 steps: the awareness of one's poverty, the purification through meditation, and I will come back to read a bit the text together on that, then the illumination of the intellect, and then ascending out on mission. What is quite specific about that text is that it's addressed to everybody with no previous knowledge of Christianity required. And it uses very few references, explicit references to Christianity, to the scriptures, or to liturgy, or to rites like baptism or sacraments and things like that. And so there was a debate in the history to know even if the manuscript was Christian or not. So my point of view is that it's very deeply Christian and that it's deeply anchored in Syriac mysticism. And I have another paper that will come out in a few months in the Scottish Journal of Theology, where I try to demonstrate that it's very close to the thinking of Isaac of Nineveh, or Isaac the Syrian, who was a mystic in Mesopotamia, in a place that sent many monks in China and in Tufan. And it borrows many of the vocabulary of the Chan Buddhist school. We can take a bit some examples to dig a bit and try to read a bit the text together. What is specific in this text is that it uses nature as a way to contemplate, and the goal of contemplation is to become aware of some facts that affect us as human beings in this world. So we can take the example of this passage. Second, meditate on this passing world. So this is part of 10 exercises that the Messiah gives to Simon Peter to train him, which is a bit like the spiritual exercises in Indian spirituality. The goal of the exercise is to be aware of something so that to progress on the path. There are those you dearly love and who are close to you. You will have to leave them, and it is not certain that one day you will be reunited with them. You are like the many leaves gathered on the same tree. The wind blows, the frost descends, and the tree's trunk is exhausted. The leaves fall, they scatter and wither, and soon there is nothing left. So the goal is to be more aware of death, of the fact that we will die. Meditate on this passing world. There are those who are beautiful and adulated, filled with glory and success. They too will not live forever. They are like the full moon which lights up the nights. It's round and beautiful, it shines on all sides. Clouds may gather, mist may rise, days may pass, and soon it changes. However bright it might be, can you count on its light for long? So the goal is the same. By meditating on the moon, we become aware of the vanity of human glory. Meditate on this passing world. Human selfishness is violent and cruel. People want to act for their own benefit, but in reality, their desires only bring them harm. Selfishness makes you like moths, like mosquitoes, running towards the lights that illuminate your nights, thinking that they are good for you. And then you are surprised when your lives are destroyed in the flames. Meditate on this passing world. There are those who amass treasures, who pile up riches. For that they work hard. They suffer greatly. But in the end, it is absolutely useless. They are like little flasks that would like to contain the waters of the rivers and the seas. They can fill their little flask, but when they have filled them up to the brim, they will no longer be able to take anything. Meditate on this passing world. There are sex, passions, and pleasures that block you. Desire arises from your bodies. It excites your bodies, but desire deceives you. It's like a larva that lives inside a tree. It can damage the entire tree by eating only its core. Then the tree withers because it rots from the inside. Slowly it wastes away and it finally falls. Meditate on this passing world. There are those who pretend to do good works because they seek the recognition of the crowds. They do not realize that they are swindling themselves. They are like oysters that contain luminous pearls. When the fishermen open them to take the pearls, they kill them. They only want others to admire them, then they are surprised to suffer. So in these passages, what is surprising is that the imagery borrows from many different sources. For example, the image of the oyster is very common in Syriac mystical writings because most of the monks came from what we call today Qatar, a place where there were many oyster and pearls and things like that. But some other images seem to have been created by the monk who seemingly wrote the text, and some of them borrow from Chinese Buddhistic sources as well. So to conclude, I presented the text. We read some of the passages together to give you the taste to read them more. Then I will speak a bit about some opportunities for research or for future studies if you are interested in that field. I think the first direction for research is that this text give a lot of materials to understand more early Christianity. Maybe you know of Robert Taft, who was a scholar living in Rome that was mainly interested, not in Rome, I'm not sure, that was mainly interested in liturgy and liturgical studies. And one of the laws he formulates is that the more a text is written in the periphery, the more it keeps some very early material that changed at the center. And I think that's the case of many of the texts we have in Chinese. Because it was written very far away from the center, it contains some very interesting material to understand some of the traditions that influence the gospel and that influence apocryphal writings and early Christian studies. And it's also the case for many material written in Syriac and Sogdian that were discovered in Dunhuang and Tuefan. So this is the first area of research. If you are familiar with early Christian studies, I think you can dig on this material and find many interesting things. The first direction is that these texts are some illustrations of some more broader cultural exchanges and relations between the East and the West. And the monks, the officials that wrote this text, were part of a broader network of people living in China, but having strong relations with Sassanid, Byzantine, Roman empires. And we find in the sources, apart from the Christian text, other elements that document the fact that there were many exchanges, especially in scientific and technical expertise in medicine. We know that the Greek medicine material was translated in Syriac, then in Arabic, and was then brought in China, and some of the material passed even in Chinese. In astronomy, in mechanics, so you have, for example, a paper that was written a few months ago in the Journal Asiatique in France, but the paper is in English, that tries to document that in the Chinese sources you have an event in 714 where a monk presents at the court some very marvelous technology, and she advocates that this is these things on the right. And so it's a way to study the text and to try to enter in that material to see how it documents Sino-Western relations. Then, of course, a big area for research, and I tried to make a bit, but I think there is many more things to say, is to try to study the Chinese expression for conveying Christian thought and Christian beliefs. I take a few examples here of the names that we will find in the text. Some of them are borrowed from Buddhistic ways of speaking of the Buddha or the Bodhisattva, like Tiantun or Shutun. Some of them are creations or apaks, like Yishan. like Sani, but that exist also in Taoistic material. Some of them are transcriptions like Aloe or borrowings that derives from Syriac Aloho, that comes from Hebrew Elohim, which is one of the names for God. Like Luchonim Chusha, that came from the Syriac Rucha di Kedusha, which is one of the name of the Holy Spirit. And some of them pass through Sogdian, like Qingfeng, which doesn't have many sense in Chinese, but which is very close to the way to call the Holy Spirit in Sogdian. And I think there is a big place to study these expressions, to understand them, to understand what they borrow as Buddhistic and Taoistic and Confucian understanding of the divinity, and to compare them with the modern expressions we use today. And this is a very promising field, which is very few things are made in this field. So this is it. I try to introduce you in my bad English, in my French English, to the historical context, then to present the text as we have them, and then to read part of them to try to understand a bit the material, and to propose some areas for your own research and interest. Thank you very much.